So firstly, thanks everyone for coming. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous evening, and you're here, so that's, testament to something about you, potentially, or us, but we're very grateful. Before I introduce the speakers in the event, I'll just say something very brief about Civic Future and why we're putting on this event. So Civic Future was set up nearly 3 years ago now, I think, by CEO Munira Mirza, who sensed that there was a mismatch between the talent, energy, and ingenuity in the country at large and the political class, which didn't necessarily reflect that at all times. So part of the impetus for Civic Future is to try and get talented young people into public life and into politics, and to get those already in public life to reckon with fundamental political challenges rather than opting for a kind of quiet life on the backbenches, building some like minor campaign in their constituency, but not engaging with the fundamental questions of governance that are reshaping our country. And why this event in particular on immigration. I think immigration for some time was seen as almost apolitical. It was part of the inevitable tide of globalization. And even if politicians acknowledged legitimate concerns people might have around it, that was usually as a precursor to doing precisely nothing about it. And we had a kind of slightly weird paradoxical mix in our country for quite a long time, which is a weird mix of quite punitive, often individually unpleasant rhetoric with a very, very large scale of immigration, certainly compared to our history. But in a sense, I think immigration is one of the most profound and fundamental of all political questions. It's about to whom we owe our deepest loyalties, to whom do we extend the first person plural, the we that constitutes the British people. And wherever we fall on the spectrum, that's not a trivial question. In recent years, I think things have changed, and immigration has kind of become re-politicized and often in unpleasant ways has become more a part of our national media discourse and so on. I think that's largely prompted by the sheer scale of immigration. So in the years 1972 to 97, you have cumulatively around 68,000 people moving here net, which I think amounts to about 2,700 per year net. Some years there was net inflow, some years there was a net outflow. At immigration's peak about 2-3 years ago, that the cumulative degree of immigration that happened over 25 years would happen over about 3 weeks 2 years ago. So that's the degree of, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but that's the degree of the scale of change. And I think that's prompted its return in salience and priority in the political discourse, and it's why we're talking about it. There's also a growing cross-party consensus that this is the case and that immigration must come down. Keir Starmer obviously famously talked about the ending the open borders experiment, and the opposition parties are also kind of competing over who can clamp down on immigration the most or talk about how they might do so. But how to do it and how far to go and why has it proved tricky thus far, the questions we want to explore tonight, and how are other countries, particularly allies on the continent, dealing with this question. Years ago, in the kind of mid-90s, there was a burgeoning academic literature about Britain as this exception on the continent. Britain alone had managed to keep immigration levels low while providing rising living standards and growth. Now everyone turns to Denmark as the kind of country of exception, particularly those on the left often look to the Danish Social Democrats as a party that have bucked the trend in Europe and proved that you can control immigration while being firmly from the social democratic tradition. So I'm delighted that we have both of our two panelists today. So we've got Joachim Olsen, who's a Danish journalist and former member of the Danish Parliament. He represents the Liberal Alliance, a centre-right party. He's also a former Olympic shot putter and is now the opinion editor of the national newspaper of record in Denmark. Pronounced?
Berlingske Tidende is gonna make no sense to you.
Fine, there we go. And Jonathan Hinder is part of the new intake of Labour MPs. He's the MP for Pendle in Clitheroe, and he was formerly a police officer, sergeant and inspector, and he's one of the leaders of the Blue Labour group in Parliament. And we'll begin with opening remarks from both of them, beginning, I think, with Jonathan, and then I'll take the liberty of asking some follow-up questions before we turn to the audience for questions. Jonathan.
Okay, Thank you very much, Tobias. I think you've set the scene brilliantly and means that I can scratch through a bit of my introduction myself, which is good news for everyone. I thought one of the stats that really stuck out to me to kind of frame this debate was that before 1994, most years Britain had negative net migration. So just a kind of sense of the scale of the difference that we've seen over the last 30 years, but particularly obviously over the last 20 and then the last 5. And Britain is such a tolerant country. I think other countries in Europe look to us and think, wow, you really have got a multiracial country there, which I think of as a bit of a miracle, to be honest. And I always think about Rishi Sunak's comment about having become the first Asian Prime Minister and saying, the best thing about it is no one really cares. And that's always, stuck with me as something we should kind of strive for in so many things. And if you think about our Western continental partners, to think that they would have as many frontline politicians from an immigrant background is really quite unthinkable. So we really have done something quite extraordinary in this country, and it's that being put at risk that I am really most concerned about. And I think the experiment that we've seen in recent years is putting that at risk. And over the last 20 years, governments have basically said we're going to get immigration down consistently, and then done the opposite. So it has really, really serious consequences for people's faith in politicians. And for those of you who knock doors, I'm sure it's a very familiar refrain that it doesn't matter, nothing changes, and that is true on this topic as much as any. And the broader point that I would love to open us up to in this kind of forum is, what is immigration for? How do we want immigration to enrich our country? Because it doesn't feel like we've really had that discussion. Our approach has been kind of, at best, incoherent, and at worst, non-existent. We haven't had an approach. It's just kind of happened. So I'm obviously a Labour backbencher, so I should rattle through what the government has said it's going to do, what its priorities are. Said it's going to bring down net migration, reduce the reliance on overseas labour, tackle the smuggling gangs, clear the asylum backlog, increase removals. Can anyone disagree with that? I think there's a pretty strong consensus in the country that that's what we want to see. But I think we are yet to see the decisive interventions which are going to see those objectives hit. And I wrote an article recently talking about quangos mostly, but a general attitude as well, which is that the British government doesn't run the country. It's deferred so many of its decisions elsewhere. And nowhere is that attitude of, well, we can't change it because it's too difficult. Nowhere is that more evident than on immigration. You see that in the competitions between departments as the Home Office tries to wrestle control, and you see the other departments saying, no, we just cannot do this. So we do need to drastically reduce immigration very quickly, and that might mean sometimes prioritising democratic decisions over international legal constraints. I want to talk about the economics, because we've allowed entire sectors of our economy to become structurally dependent on migration. And the state has walked away from actually planning for the skills that we need in those sectors. Again, the government is absolutely right to be talking about tackling the high levels of immigration in this way. But a left-wing government really, in my view, should say, what does our country need? What skills are required to build the kind of economy that we want? And we no longer train enough of many key professions. And a lot of liberal commentators and academics say, well, we don't have enough of insert profession here to build the houses we need, say. Partly due to the need for which is partly due to huge immigration, right? So immigration needs to stay high so that we can have the people over to build those houses. It's a circular, absurd argument. And if I could kind of bring my own kind of politics into this, why can we not train more builders? They say, well, British people here don't want to do it. And why don't they want to do it? Well, the wages and the terms and the conditions aren't good enough. So what's the left-wing solution, or what has been the, inverted commas, left-wing solution? It's get the cheap labour in from abroad, of course. That's what us leftists think, isn't it? It's absolutely crazy. It doesn't even make sense. So the state needs to take a much more active role in shaping the economy and having the skills there for those sectors that we really need. There's nothing economically left-wing about high immigration, is my contention. And I want to talk about the left's position more broadly, Labour's position on immigration, and where we've got to on it. Because when I speak to my constituents, too many working class people see Labour as the party of immigrants, minorities, those on benefits. Basically, not for them anymore. And that's the key word always, anymore. That's what they say. But the British Labour Party was founded to represent working class people. So how did we get to the point where so many of them feel that we're more concerned with those from other countries than we are about them? I'm firmly on the left economically, but people describe me and the Blue Labour group as socially conservative because I want low immigration, I back the police, I want strong armed forces. And I think it's a statement of how far we've drifted as a party and a Labour movement that that's seen as notable in the Labour Party these days. So we urgently need to correct course, or we will cease to be a party of the working class. And we might not have actually had another chance to repair our bond with the working classes, but the Conservatives' implosion in 2022 just gave us that one last chance, and we must take it. Very quickly, if I could just nod to integration. I'd love to talk about that. I think it's something that's going to be talked about more and more over time. The fact that we have got such large immigrant communities in some parts of the country, including mine in East Lancashire, is leading, I think, in many cases to more parallel lives being lived and less integration. I think we've been asleep at the wheel on that as a country, and I'd love to get people's thoughts on how we can go about improving that. And just as a final point, the kind of two imperatives on politics from a Labour perspective. Just imagine for a second if Labour sorted this out. We didn't just say the right things because we're saying the right things, but we actually moved at pace to sort this out. And we moved close to a balance between inward and outward migration. The Conservatives left us with this, so they haven't got a leg to stand on it. When it comes to reform, they haven't really got anything else. So we need to shoot the reform fox now. And a word to those who say we'd lose people to our left. Well, no. The vast majority of the public want lower immigration. That is not a controversial thing. And you see people who voted for the Liberal Democrats instead of the Conservatives saying part of it was their failure on immigration. They just wanted to get them out because of that perceived failure. But the politics isn't the main reason to do this. The main reason is the moral imperative because it's the right thing to do. I still believe this government can deliver on reducing illegal immigration and legal immigration very significantly, but time is already running out to make a big difference and restore people's faith in democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Joachim, do you want to respond? Is Denmark the Holy Land, the Holy Grail?
Oh, I don't know about that, but when I listen to you, Jonathan, it's like the debate you're having now is a debate we had maybe 20 years ago in Denmark. Just like a brief history of Danish immigration policy. Like in 1983, the Danish Parliament adopted maybe the most liberal immigration policy in the whole of Europe. It was pretty much open borders. And it was actually adopted by a conservative government, but it was a minority government and they were kind of pushed to do it, but they still did it. And so I'll jump forward to 1995. There was a new party in Denmark called like the Danish People's Party, which was like a national conservative party, and their number one topic was immigration, like no immigration, really, no asylum seekers, nothing. Pretty far right party in Denmark. But the thing was that their voters were, to a larger and larger degree, Labour voters, because on on all other policies, they were pretty left. They went into a coalition in 2001, which was a very essential election in Denmark. It was the first election where the Conservative Party in Denmark, it's a little bit hard to translate because we have a lot of parties in Denmark. We don't have a two-party system, but still the Conservative coalition, it was the first time that the Conservative coalition had more working class voters than the Social Democrats had. So the working class started voting Conservative, and it was because of immigration. And we call that the system change election in 2001. And the Labour Party was, which is the big party in Denmark, it's the consistently, and to this day, the consistently big party in Denmark. And I think they kind of see themselves, if they don't have, if they're not in government, something is very, very wrong in Denmark. They kind of see it as almost their right. So, but from 2001 to 2011, they had 10 years where they lost all elections, and they lost it on immigration every time. And so in 2011, they won with Helle Thorning-Schmidt, which has some Danish, Stephen Kinnock, which is a member of the European Parliament for Labour. And she tried to kind of turn it around, tried to get some of those voters back from the Danish People's Party. But to be honest, I don't think she was very believable, because for a long time it's very hard for a party to kind of change policy. If it's the same politicians who's change policy, it's not very believable. And that was kind of the case. So they lost the election in 2015. And then, and I was in Parliament back then, and Mette Frederiksen, who is now the Prime Minister in Denmark, became the leader of the Social Democratic Party. And she completely changed the Danish Labour Party's policies on this. And the way she did it, it was like she went all in. It was kind of like there was no policy proposal that the Conservative coalition could make on immigration that she would say no to. She pretty much said, otherwise she would say, like, we're willing to discuss that. It didn't matter what it was, almost. And it took a couple of years, and then she changed kind of the minds of working class people, and she became very believable. And it's because she actually also means it. And the reason I think why the Social Democrats changed so much was that, one, they lost a lot of voters, but what you saw from '83 and onward in Denmark was that a lot of neighborhoods completely changed. They had a big inflow of immigrants. And it was especially around Copenhagen, and it was like social democratic labor municipalities, and they completely changed. And in some of these municipalities, Danish people became the minority, and they just started voting. And it's not because they were racist. It's nothing to do with that. It was simply that this was not something that they felt was agreed upon, that they had never voted for this. They had never said, we want that many people to come to Denmark. And so Mette Frederiksen, she made this turnaround and got the voters back at the election in 2015. That was right after all the refugees from Syria. The Danish People's Party got 21% of the votes and was almost bigger than the Social Democrats. Second biggest party in the parliament. In 2019, they got 8.6% of the votes, and so it's a very significant change that the Labour Party made, and they got voters back. There was also some problems in the Danish People's Party, like internal conflicts and so on, and they also lost voters because of that. But what they essentially did was that instead of fighting the Danish People's Party, they kind of embraced them and hugged them to death, and like not turning down any proposals, and that was a big success for them. And it kind of boils down to, and that's what the Social Democrats in Denmark says, that they've realized there's like 3 recognitions. I'll use that word, but they said the first recognition, and we made that in the 90s, is that numbers matter. It matters how many people who come to your country. You can't integrate a lot of people at one time, and that was the first recognition. The second recognition that they made was that integration is not just about people working, having jobs, paying taxes. That's kind of like a basic thing that you need to do. But that in itself is not integration. Integration is that in many years we talked about integration in Denmark as it was like Danish people have to meet foreigners and we kind of have to make a compromise. But that's not really integration. Integration is that they integrate into our society, our norms, our values. Doesn't mean that you can keep your religion and your customs, but you adapt the fundamental values and norms, women's rights, sexual minorities' rights. You are loyal to Denmark. That's integration. And we've had problems with that, to be honest, a lot of problems. And the third recognition, which is a new one, and that's a very talented young Labour politician in Denmark called Frederik Vad. And the third recognition is that, and that goes to speak about like integration, is that we just had a report come out in Denmark. It's an initial report, but it lists examples of people with, to be honest, is Muslim backgrounds, working in the public sector as social workers, police officers, even in the public sector. And the examples show that when these people meet Danish people, they'll follow the rules, but when they meet people from their own culture, they change. So the examples would be like, you have and these are concrete examples from this report, like examples of police officers who, you have a woman, she's being beat up by her husband. She goes to a woman crisis center, and when you go to a women's crisis center, you're anonymous, of course. And they give out the name. They tell the husband where she is, because in their culture, you don't run away from your husband. Or it can be another example of a woman wanting an abortion, and she's a Muslim, and the Muslim doctor says you're not supposed to get an abortion. He wouldn't say that to a Danish person. So it's kind of like there's been a realization that even though people are integrated, have jobs, you see these examples of them enforcing cultural norms from their own country. And that is like, in Danish society, it's completely unacceptable. So it's kind of been those, and I think that speaks very well to the debate that we have in Denmark. It's kind of moved away from like integration being a compromise to, no, if you come to Denmark, you have to integrate into our society, and you have to adapt, at least you have to adapt our norms and values, fundamental norms and values. And the problem is that we've just had a lot of problems with that. And I think sometimes, because I haven't seen anywhere else in Europe where you've tried to investigate how, like examples of what I just spoke about, like examples of like people in the public sector treating people different. And I'm sure if it happens in Denmark, I'm sure it happens everywhere in Europe. And it's just that's like an example of why the Social Democrats in Denmark are very, very tough on immigration. It's been one, of course, it's been to get voters back, but it's also been a realization that the Danish welfare state, which is a very generous welfare state, is that a welfare state is not, and I think that goes for any country, it's not just based on laws and rights. It's not just the letter of the law. It's also something that you have to adapt. It's also culture. And for instance, like in Denmark, the Social Democrats have this saying called "Do your duty, claim your rights." I don't know if you have it over here, but it's like you have to do your duties. You have to, if you can work, you have to work. If you you have to contribute to society. And when you contribute and you end up in problems or you lose your job, yes, then there's benefits. But as soon as you can get a job, you take that job. But rules can't guarantee that you do that. That is also a cultural thing. It's just like you are looked down upon in Danish culture if you're on benefits, even if you can work. And that's a cultural thing. And there's really nothing that can, if you don't want to work because in your culture women don't work, well then it's very hard actually to get people to work. So a lot of immigration policies in Denmark has been really about, to be honest, to make Denmark a very unattractive country to go to if you want to continue living by your norms and values from your home country. Then it's a very unattractive country to come to. The latest law that it's in process now in the Danish parliament is that if you're on benefit and you're an immigrant, we've had a lot of, like, especially women, never joining the labor market in Denmark, going home, being at home, but that's, from now on, that's not going to be, you're going to be working 37 hours a week, cleaning the streets, doing that sort of stuff, if you want your benefits. So, and that's just one example. And there's not been one law in Denmark. You can't like say this was this law and then the numbers started dropping. It's a whole lot of different laws, all aiming to tighten immigration. But the goal has been, to be honest, to make it an unattractive country to seek asylum in. And that has been, of course, 20 years ago, this was a very controversial debate. It was very heated, but it's not anymore. It's a very, and I think one of the reasons why it's been successful is that when numbers are low, when immigration is low, when asylum seekers are low, there are no. Then it's like nobody is saying, "Oh, we should have more asylum seekers." It's like you don't really miss it. It's when it's very high and you see all the problems. When you have to kick somebody out, that's always very sensitive because it also hits people sometimes where you think, come on, that's a shame, but you have to treat everybody the same. That's when it's a problem, but it's not a problem when numbers are low. Nobody is complaining about that. And even if you go to the far left parties in Denmark, to the left of the Labour parties, and you ask their voters, they will say, well, we don't, 50% of like the party on the far left in Denmark, 50% of their voters say they don't want looser immigration policies. So for the Labour Party, it has been a huge success, but it took a long time, and they had to lose a lot of elections before they changed. But they did, and I think what Mette Frederiksen said, she said, you know, the Labour Party in Denmark should be where our voters are. They should be aligned with our voters. If we are not aligned with our voters, it's our policies that are wrong. And that was a big change, because before that it was, they kind of tried, earlier on they tried to convince their voters that, we need, it's bad with tight immigration policies. But the voters really didn't care about that, because they were living with the consequences.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks so much for both those opening remarks. I'll ask maybe 2 or 3 questions before I open it up. So first, returning to Jonathan, you've heard a persuasive kind of case for why the Danish Social Democrats were able to do this, how they profited from it. We know from public opinion polls in this country that about 70% of the public thinks immigration is too high versus 4% who think it's too low, which is more or less in the margin of error of 0. Governments have been elected, I think, in every election since 1992 on a platform to reduce immigration. No government has succeeded. What's going on? Why is it so difficult? Are we wrong?
Well, I guess there's different phases to assess during that period. I mean, I think, whatever people thought about Brexit, immigration was a massive factor in that vote. There's no doubt about it. And since 2016, we have had the ability to control our own borders. Putting aside the ECHR, I don't know whether we'll discuss that at some point, but without that freedom of movement, that for me, that is the most unforgivable period, because it was going directly against what the voters were saying quite explicitly, not hidden in a general election, but actually at referendum. So the honest answer, Tobias, is I don't know. And I certainly don't know why a Conservative government allowed that to happen. But certainly from what I understand is even going on now, there has to be very strong leadership from Number 10 and the Home Office, because there are lots of departments who, in the short term, will say our farming system, our social care system, whatever it is going to really struggle if we don't have large numbers coming over. I mean, I think that argument becomes increasingly ridiculous when you've got numbers as high as we have, 3 times what it was at the Brexit referendum. But nonetheless, that argument does still get made. And so it needs very strong leadership, which we haven't always had at the centre, to drive that through, along with the Home Office, if you're going to push back against those other interests. But I mean, my fundamental answer remains, I don't know, but I think a politician that does it will be handsomely rewarded.
Thanks. And can I and I want to ask one more question for you too.
Okay, if I can make, because I forgot this point, but I think it speaks to something that you said, and that is that when the Social Democrats in Denmark went to the right, let's just call it that, on immigration, tighten it up, very strict immigration policies, and of course there were to the left of the Social Democrats parties that disagreed with that, and that was the parties that the Social Democrats normally would be in a coalition with. But what the Social Democrats said, they said, listen, we are going to do this, because we're not going to win any elections if we don't do it, so you are not going to have any influence either. So we are going to make the compromise that we are going to have strict immigration policies. You don't have to vote for it. We're going to make it with the Conservatives. But what they did was they went to the left in the economic policies. And so that was kind of the deal, that the people, the politicians and parties on the left that didn't like tight immigration, they got more left-wing economic policies. And that was the compromise. And so today, the parties to the left of the Social Democrats, they will complain about the social and criticize the Social Democrats for their immigration policies, but they're never gonna topple them. They're just gonna speak. They're just gonna talk and complain, because they know it's the only way they're gonna get influence, and they're gonna get influence on the economic policy. So that's the compromise.
Jonathan mentioned the ECHR and prioritising domestic law, if necessary, over international law. And whenever we talk about immigration in this country, the ECHR is never that far away, and often conversations fixate on Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights and the way in which that constrains domestic governance and decision makers. Has international law arisen in the Danish context? Have there been clashes around it?
All the time, and that's important. There is a big discussion in Denmark, and that is that we're not happy about. I mean, we have joined every single convention, every single sub addition to every convention. We have joined more conventions than you have in Britain, and so that is a big discussion. But the immigration policies that Denmark has made are within conventions. With both conservative and Labour governments in Denmark test the boundaries, how far can we go, and they want to change it too. But I think Denmark is a very small country, and these conventions are not going to be changed because Denmark says so. That has to be because Germany says so, or you say so, the big countries in Europe. And France, I really don't understand, to be honest, why the big countries that can actually change some of the conventions, they don't go into that discussion more, because of course they are a problem. I mean, Mette Frederiksen has told me personally, because I have a cup of coffee with her once in a while, not because she likes me, but because she wants me to write what she says. And she thinks it's a problem. She thinks it's a democratic problem that you can't make the policies that you believe are the right ones for your countries. But we are within. But we test the limits in Denmark all the time. And sometimes we are told that, oh, you can't do that. One of the biggest issues in Denmark in terms of the conventions are that when you have people who are denied asylum and are told to leave, and if they've done crimes, when they've done their time in Danish prison and they are expelled, they don't leave. And what the Danish politicians want to do is say, okay, really every day you are here, you're breaking the law because we told you to leave. And the home country, if the home country won't take them because they don't want to leave, they don't want to take people that don't want to leave voluntarily. So we have set up these, how do you describe it? Facilities where they have to stay, but they can leave. And we had just half a year ago, one of them was drunk and hit a woman and she died. And but it's just an example of really what the Danish politicians want to do is say to people who have committed crimes in Denmark, are thrown out but don't leave, that we want to lock them up. And we can't do that because of conventions. That's just one example.
There was the Brighton Declaration in sometime in around 2014, 15, something like that, 2012, which reaffirmed the principle of subsidiarity in the ECHR and the priority of domestic legislation, and it's kind of promptly been ignored and never really cited in any cases, or it's kind of been disappeared somewhat. Jonathan, you kind of tentatively hinted at this potential clash between domestic law and international law. Do you want to expand at all on what you think we should do with the ECHR?
Well, I think it's quite clear that it's not working. And, as lots of people have said more eloquently than me, the people who signed that originally would be kind of astonished at what it's actually become. There's all sorts of crazy judgments that we've seen come out of it. Huge judicial overreach. So I think it's clear that it isn't working. And the question is, what do we do about it? As Joachim says, I'm sure we would find common cause amongst some of the signatories, some of the big countries, but it is really difficult to do. Clearly something like the Brighton Declaration, kind of sticking with the same thing, but saying we're going to be grown-ups now hasn't worked. So it needs to be something quite significant that changes that. But I don't think anything should be off the table because it just is not good enough for the government to say, we can't do this, even though we know this is what the voters want. It's not good enough for a government to say, actually, we don't control who comes into our country. So I'm open-minded. I'm not an expert on the intricacies, but I really think everything should be on the table.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. I think now let's open it up, and maybe we'll take maybe 2 or 3 at a time, and then try and answer. We'll deal with this side of the room first. So Stella, Jonathan, and then.
I think the framing of the whole question today has been absolutely terrible. And even though I have been skeptic of immigration for some time, and very recently I have started writing about how we need to reform the ECHR, really what I want to be, if I was Keir Starmer, I would probably even be saying we are leaving the ECHR tomorrow. But the way you guys have been talking about immigration today is seriously freaking me out, because you are asking the question, it was the question, Tobias, of the whole event, and then you, Jonathan, started with the question, what is immigration for? How do we want immigration to enrich our country? States, Jonathan, do not decide who migrates. States decide whether they allow someone to come into their country, and then they decide how they treat that person based on the values of that country. It is individuals who decide whether they want to migrate or not. Otherwise, it's called slavery. So we are over that. Very bad framing. And Jonathan, if you want to convince your Labour voters, your constituents, that they need to be immigration skeptic, or the word I like to use is immigration neutral, and you also want to create a consensus about the ECHR. You want to not freak out people who genuinely care about human rights, and they have seen how human rights can be abused in other countries. So I think the framing is completely wrong. I think it totally reflects people's values that, for example, violent criminals, pedophiles should be deported. I do not think anybody has any problems with that. But I do think that then when you're saying that the policy is to make a country as unattractive as possible for asylum seekers, and there were some policies, for example, that I saw that Denmark did a long time ago, I'm not sure whether they are still in place. For example, taking refugees' possessions to fund their accommodation and all of that, which I think just sounds cruel without any actual functional reason. I think this takes it for granted that every single asylum seeker deserves to be punished a little bit.
I'll answer your question.
Okay, Jonathan, thank you, Stella.
So I'm a Labour Party member. I love my party. I think that it should get immigration down to a much more sustainable level, and it's totally unsustainable at the moment. And yet I know that if that happened under a Labour government, at a certain point, the membership, which does support a higher rate of immigration than I believe is right for the country, would react quite strongly against the leadership of the party, maybe replace them with something much more pro-immigration. So this is sort of a question about Denmark, but it's also a question about the Labour Party. How, when you were managing that transition, or when the Social Democrats were managing that transition, how do you prevent the backlash from the grassroots? You talked a bit about it. To what extent was it a top-down change that people just became accustomed to? Or was there a genuine changing of minds within the party where people started to accept this is the right course, this is paying dividends for us, and we're willing to accept this bargain, as you talk about, of having left-wing politics with a degree of social conservatism on the border?
Great, thanks. And maybe we'll take one more and then, then you guys can respond. Yeah, the person directly behind Jonathan here. And what's your name, sorry?
Yeah, my name is Mauricio. I'm a reporter, economics reporter at City, but I'm not reporting on this. Jonathan, it's just a question for you. The government white paper on immigration is obviously coming soon. And one of the points of contention and friction is around student visas, but also worker visa thresholds. What are the changes actually that you want to see as a backbencher, and how realistic are those proposals that you have in mind actually going to come into that white paper?
Sure.
Shall we start with, do you want to start with that question on the white paper and then we'll work backwards?
Yeah, sure. Really glad you brought that up, because it's another one of these circular arguments, isn't it? So you'll have people from a very powerful higher education lobby who say, well, we need foreign students to kind of service these universities, which are pumping out degrees of dubious quality, of dubious value to the economy. I'm happy to be bold and say I don't think we should have anywhere near as many universities or as many university places. We know that a lot of these universities are essentially acting as routes to migrate onto different routes in the future. I'd be really keen to see strong action on that. And I think there's a broader point about, again, our higher education sector, and saying, well, if we don't have these people coming from abroad, they're going to go bust. Well, I'd say, okay, I'm not that disappointed about that, because I'm not quite sure what the social value is of some of these universities and some of these courses.
Can you get back on the tactics to prevent a grassroots backlash from within the Danish Social Democrats?
Of course, this change in the Labour Party didn't happen overnight. It was a long process. It started in 2001, and the Labour Party made the big change in 2016. So it took a long time. There's a difference between Danish and British politics, I guess. You don't have a two-party system, but you've had pretty much two parties, right?
Until recently.
Yeah, until recently, right? But in Denmark we have a lot of parties. So the Labour Party, doing this change, lost voters to parties to the left of the Labour Party, for sure they did. But they gained more voters who had left the Labour Party and gone to the National Conservative Party. So I think the rationale in the Labour Party was, okay, we're going to lose some voters, but they're not going to go right, they're going to go left, and they're going to support us to join a government. So they're just in another party, but it's a net plus for us, because we're going to pull voters over the middle and get the majority. So, and they are just as big now as they were 10 years ago. So they haven't really lost voters. What they have done is won elections. To your question, it's called the jewelry law in Denmark. And it gained a lot of international attention. And the law is, pretty much as you said, the law is that if you have assets, personal assets, cash, even jewelry that's worth a lot of money, then you can't receive any benefits, because we actually expect you to live off your own funds. That's in the Danish constitution. It says you have to, how do you translate it? In the Danish constitution, it says that you have to, you have to take care of your own before the state can take care of you. But the thing is, the jewelry law, that law, it's the jewelry law is a popular name for it. It applies to Danish people too. It's always applied to Danish people. When we started applying it to immigrants, it was saying that you need to be. What? Sorry?
Family heirlooms.
We have never done that. We have never taken a wedding ring or family. You have something you have inherited from your mother. It's never happened. Actually, the law has never been used. But it was a small part of a law which was saying that the laws that apply to Danish people, they have to apply to immigrants too. It's always applied for Danish people. But it gained a lot of attention because it got this, you're going to take the people's wedding rings. That hasn't ever been done. But if you come to Denmark with 10,000 pounds in cash, you're not going to receive any benefits. That's true. Why should we pay you benefits if you have money yourself?
We may return to the kind of question of how to prevent human rights abuses and other forms of cruelty while having I guess, controlled migration later on, but I want to move on to other people who want to speak. And we'll turn to this side of the room and then go back. So, yes.
I wanted to ask you a question about how difficult you think it will be and how much resistance you think you'll find specifically in the Parliamentary Labour Party in terms of like trying to reduce immigration. What's your perspective on that from being like a member of the Blue Labour caucus? There's more to it, but I've forgotten it.
Sure. Yeah, succinct is great. Yes, the woman behind. Yep.
Thank you. This is another question for Jonathan. Can you explain the thinking behind your government's policy of denying citizenship to people who will be recognised as refugees, but who arrived in the UK by a so-called dangerous route, when for many people there are no safe routes? And in my view, this will lead to people excluded from society, excluded from voting. And really, to sort of just to give some background to this discussion, to say that Britain's wealth is built on the backs of people from other countries, both through empire and from people coming to the UK as migrants. And migrants continue to contribute on balance to Britain's wealth if they are allowed to work, and many are not. And I think demonising migrants is ugly and dangerous, and I think the Labour Party needs to be very careful about pandering to reform voters.
Thank you. And then the person just to your right. Yeah.
Hello. I had a question about, this can go for both of you, I'd be interested to see. If immigration is sorted out, given the rate and scale of it over the past 10 years, we've seen a ghettoisation of certain areas of the UK. And this contrasts with actually, previous integrative measures in the UK. I was at a Civic Futures event before, and someone asked me, what's the success story of immigration? And my first thought was the UK, the Windrush generation. So we get immigration down to net zero. What's the next stage for integration and moving beyond the kind of situation we have now?
So I wondered, Jonathan, whether you want to take on the first two questions. So one about the PLP and where you think that is, and one about demonising migrants, their contribution and past citizenship.
Sure. So yeah, I'm optimistic with the new PLP. Obviously, it's very new. I haven't been around all 400 of them to know what they think, but you get a good sense of it. Certainly, the new cohort of MPs, of which I am one, and is the majority of the party, are very pragmatic about this. So do want to see it reduced. They might not be quite as, how do I put it, impolite as to speak about it as kind of candidly as I am right now, but they absolutely understand that electoral imperative, that we just cannot go on like this. So having these conversations all the time about wanting to get the government's message out there about it. So yeah, as I say, they might not be as kind of full of their convictions as me, but I'm optimistic that they really do want to see this tackled. And I think as the Parliament goes on, you'll see more people start to speak up in that regard. On the policy about citizenship, so I absolutely think that there should be people who are asylum seekers who ultimately have the opportunity to become British citizens in the future. But that specific policy is about a deterrent, and there has to be some sort of deterrent, as we've heard. Okay. But I'm saying that's what we're talking about, isn't it? Is actually making it kind of possible to have safe and legal routes. But we're not going to be able to have that while we've still got this current situation. So we need to get the situation under control so we could get to the point where we say the UK as a whole takes a certain number every year of asylum seekers, refugees from particular areas of the world. We might want to say it's up to us as a country what we decide, but we decide, and that goes to the point that was made here. It's about what's the common good of Britain, and that must be where we start our discussions, not the individual circumstances of a particular individual. It has to be about the common good first of all, in terms of how we think about British immigration policy.
And Joachim, do you want to come in?
It's just because that's a debate we've had in Denmark too. And I think the question is, if you seek asylum in a country, you are a refugee, there's war in your country, you come to Britain or you come to Denmark. The meaning is not that you're supposed to stay. You're seeking asylum, and that means that when there's peace in your country, you go back to your country. That's the whole point of asylum. That's the original point with asylum. After the Second World War, we had a lot of German refugees that obviously couldn't live in Hamburg, but they went back to Germany. They got asylum. We didn't have the system back then. It wasn't invented yet. But that's the whole purpose. So in Denmark now, you don't get permanent asylum. It's temporarily asylum. And when there's peace in your home country, you can go back. We expect you to go back. It's not a road to citizenship. I'm not saying that no asylum seekers, because sometimes you have children that are born in Denmark, they've never lived in their home country, so they'll get citizenship. But the purpose of asylum is not that it's a road to citizenship. It's protection, temporary protection from the situation you were in your home country.
Thank you. Can we take some more questions? Shall we go to the back now? We'll take Ollie here, who's waiting patiently, who I missed, and then we'll go somewhere at the back. Yeah, is it Rennie and Benedict after Ollie?
This question follows up a bit on the question next to me. So it seems in lots of ways the UK state relies on kind of various fictions to uphold its existence. So it relies, for example, on not everyone claiming the educational entitlement, support plans they're entitled to. It also relies on not everyone who is entitled to claiming asylum actually being able to claim asylum. And so we put in lots of artificial measures to stop the people we say are entitled to asylum from coming here. So there are no safe routes, because the basic principle is that we can't afford to actually grant everyone who is entitled to asylum under the Refugee Convention, we can't afford to give them asylum. And so then the question should surely shift towards the obligations that we've made for ourselves. And so we should be looking at saying, oh, actually, the Refugee Convention is not actually fit for purpose today, and we need to move in Europe towards a more modern convention, which allows us to take the people from refugee camps in countries in conflict zones, but we don't actually want to be creating a system that incentivizes people to come and try and break this fictional system that we've created. So the question is, do you think there's any appetite to actually reforming those conventions, and if so, kind of where does that start? How does that happen?
Thanks. And then we'll take it back. I think I said Reddy and Benedict, and then we'll sweep over after.
Hi, thank you, Jonathan. Really interesting, and I'm sympathetic to much of what's been said. But just for the interest of debate, because just in case that we're becoming a bit of an agree fest here, I just wanted to point to you, Jonathan, that although yes, polls do say that most people want to reduce immigration, you do find different attitudes among the public on different types of migration. And actually, an argument that the liberal journalists here might say, actually, when you look at, for example, certain types of migration, they don't want it to be reduced. In fact, certain types of immigration that we might be skeptical of. So, for example, care worker visas, which I think should be lowered, but actually when you poll people, actually a minority want them to be lowered. So I think that there is a difference between, I think in this debate, we often talk about immigration in the abstract, but we also need to be more granular about the types of immigration and actually public attitude on different types of migration as well, and the effect that has on the economy and on social cohesion too. So I just wanted to add that. Secondly, you mentioned earlier that you felt that mass migration was going to threaten the racial composition of this country. Or no, not racial composition of the country, racial attitudes. No, this is not what you meant. Sorry, apologies. But no, the racial attitudes and the racial harmony in this country. But one could even argue, the liberal journalist here sitting here may say, actually, if you look from the 1990s, attitudes, concern around immigration was around 3% when it was balanced migration. But obviously British society was far more racist than it is now. We've had an increase in terms of concern on migration, but actually anti-racist attitudes have increased in that time. The Great Awakening in this country wouldn't have happened if that didn't happen. So, is it a bit alarmist to say that, huge levels of migration necessarily undermines racial harmony in this country? Reform has a Muslim chairman. Even the Front National in France, although not this country, but the Front National in France, their leader is half African. Also to the Danish journalists, very interesting as well. And, I know many people on the blue Labour side and actually the old Labour right are very interested in what's going on in Denmark and to see whether Danish social democracy might be a model to apply here. But interestingly enough, just looking at some of the stats, your net migration per capita is higher than in this country with the Boris wave, which makes me wonder, is it a question of numbers necessarily, or is it a question of the government being seen to be controlling asylum, being tough on certain immigrant groups, and I'm going to be quite controversial here, certain groups from Muslim communities, and having tough policies on asylum, but also assimilation as well. So I just wanted to throw that up there. Are we not being granular enough? Is it really the case that it's going to increase racism in our society? Is the Danish model really an example to follow in terms of reducing migration?
Thanks, Rennie. And then was it? Yeah.
This is a question primarily for Joachim. So you might have heard of the Boris wave, which is the term given to the enormous, unprecedented influx of net immigration between about 2021 and about last year, essentially because of various policy changes to Boris Johnson. Obviously, no country can possibly handle essentially more than 1% of its population entering every year. And even if the Labour government manages to get the numbers coming in each year down to much more sustainable levels, we still have the problem that we have just experienced, this enormous wave of migration to this country. Do you think that Denmark offers any lessons to Britain for dealing with the consequences of that?
Great, thank you. All right, shall we start there, and maybe you can take Rennie's final question on the actually very high levels of net migration to Denmark in concert with the question at the end about how you deal with such a high level.
Restate the last part of your question.
Does Denmark offer any lessons to Britain from your country's past with migration for dealing with very large, often potentially sudden influxes of migration?
Okay. I'll answer the other guys' questions first.
Yep.
Like, we have to be very clear what we're talking about, migration. There's two different systems here. There's people seeking asylum, that's one system. That's lower. I think it's like 4 times lower in Denmark than it is in Britain. Then you have people coming to work, and that's a totally different system. We have a lot of people coming to work, and they are under a very different set of rules. They have to have a job before they come to Denmark. So they have to have an employer who says to the government, this person has a job. They have to make quite a lot of money. In pounds, it would probably be like, it's like 50,000 pounds, maybe. We don't have and then you have certain exceptions in some areas where you can make like lower amount of money if there's like a need in that sector. So yes, we have people coming to Denmark to work from all over the world, from the United States, from India, from all sorts of different places. We like people coming to work in Denmark. The one difference is that, and that's also, listen, I'm not from Labour, so I'm trying to say what Labour in Denmark is saying, but I do agree with them on this. But Labour in Denmark has been very firm on not taking in people in low wage jobs from we say we're a member of the EU. There's 500 million people in the EU. If we need people to work in low skilled jobs, a low wage job, then you can come and work in Denmark from the EU. But they don't want, the Labour Party in Denmark, people coming and working in low wage jobs from outside the EU. But we have a lot of people coming working in Denmark, yes. But when it comes to asylum seekers, that number is much lower in Denmark than it is in Britain. Per capita, of course.
Jonathan, can I come to you on maybe first Ollie's question, which was, are we kind of living in a slightly fictional world? So I think lots of our international legal obligations and so on, we've inherited from a previous dispensation. So Bevan, who kind of helped rebuild the post-World War II international order, very much was of the view that international law should proceed from material reality, and he was a great advocate of international law, but it should proceed from material reality. And it's been estimated that around 1 billion people, up to certainly hundreds of millions of people, are eligible for asylum. Obviously, they can't all get here, but are we sustaining a kind of, living in a kind of fiction? I think this is your point, when our system corresponds to reality, which is just not.
Yeah, slightly boring answer in the sense that I agree with the thrust of what you're saying, Ollie. I think that's the thing. Once you have control, you can actually say, right, okay, what do we think we as a country want? What do we think we can cope with? We can integrate, etc. So you could actually say, well, we think it's going to be from this part of the world, this many numbers, etc. Because at the moment, it is just a fiction, as you're saying. Our obligations are impossible to meet if all of these people were actually coming here. So let's be realistic about it. And yeah, I totally agree with the thrust of what you're saying, but we're a long way from that at the moment.
And let's go to Rennie's point. So there were kind of
a
couple of things there. Yeah. Have you got them?
Yeah. So there was a granularity point.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. I think once you start getting to nearly 1 million in a year, then it's hard to kind of bring it back to granularity until you've got some sort of semblance of control again. But absolutely, I just think that's quite a weak argument when you've seen the scale of the increase. To say, well, what are we saying there? Are we saying that kind of, or get back down to 100,000 or 300,000, whatever, and then we'll start talking about granularity. That's the kind of granularity that I would be talking about. And you're absolutely right. People have got very different attitudes to different kind of blocks of that large number for understandable reasons. And then on the, I think you. I know you kind of rode back on it, but you really did quite mischaracterize what I said. But I think that the key thing is with that is that we've actually, what I meant by that was we have actually integrated huge numbers of migrants in the past, and we're no longer integrating them in that way because the numbers are so large. So we see the kind of parallel cultures existing very much separate from others at the moment. So that was kind of what I was getting at with that point. I don't mean to seem alarmist, and if I did in any way, then I apologise.
Right, thanks. Let's take more questions.
I'll answer.
Oh yeah. There's Benedict's question, but let's take Richard, and then there's kind of two questions, you, and then the two. Yeah, with the glasses and the man in front.
Thanks very much for this discussion. And Jonathan, you started by talking about the policies of the Labour government, or the priorities of the Labour government on immigration. I wondered if you could reflect on two policy decisions the Labour government's made with respect to immigration. One is the scrapping of the Rwanda scheme, and whether you thought that was the right type of policy, whether that sent the right signals from your perspective, if you think Labour should try to find some kind of equivalent, or what is the problem with that particular policy in your perspective? And then the other is the policy on EU youth mobility that we're hearing the government is now contemplating agreeing, where EU citizens under 30 or even under 35, I've heard, would have free movement into the UK, or within some kind of quota, which would be quite high. And how do you think that squares with Labour delivering on this commitment of bringing down immigration?
Thank you. And then there were two questions over here. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Tyron. If relevant, I'm a pollster, and I think I'll quickly respond to the point on public opinion that it's actually very hard to trigger a positive immigration response when you write these questions. You know, for every 10 questions you write, 9 would be anti, 1 would be positive. But the main question I wanted to ask is, so Keir Starmer's saying all the right things, public opinion's on side. There's lots of, easy doors we can push on, like Labour cutting dependent visas for students. So why do we still have very high net migration? Kind of, if all these things have lined up, what's the problem? I think so far, we've been a bit kind of nebulous on what the blockers to change are, and I'll just be interested to hear, what buttons have to be pressed, which haven't been pressed to, sort this.
Great question. And then, B just behind.
Joachim, some great literature coming out of your country, really useful, namely the welfare magnet hypothesis and the variance in contributions to the fiscal headroom, specifically that those from a non-Western background, unless East Asian, are net fiscal drag. But the welfare magnet hypothesis, 2002, welfare was reduced by 50% to those from a migrant background. It was repealed and then reintroduced, and it was found that there was an elasticity of 1.3 in terms of the migrant flux. So when you came into Parliament in 2015, these studies came, of course, later. Was there an understanding that this was the case at the time?
What was the case?
The welfare magnet hypothesis, that welfare induces demand, and also the fiscal contributions striated between cohorts. And then the second question to Jonathan is, are you hearing murmurings of this in the Parliamentary Labour Party currently?
Let's begin. Should we begin with Richard's questions for you, Jonathan? So on Rwanda and EU youth mobility.
Yeah. So, the Rwanda policy was chaotic, but do you need a deterrent in these circumstances? Well, yes, you do. And I think that is being actively discussed at the moment. I understand people's reservations, but I think that kind of creative thinking is probably going to return very quickly when the government realises that it is extremely difficult to take out criminal gangs and others not appear in their place. Speaking as a former police inspector, that's generally not how criminal gangs work. But I obviously wish them well in their efforts at present. The second point about youth mobility, freedom of movement was youth mobility. And that's what people wanted to stop when it came to the referendum. We do have these youth mobility deals with other countries, so it wouldn't really be that kind of remarkable, but I would be a little bit cautious that it isn't the thin end of a wedge, and people who, as I've said, feel like they haven't been listened to for the past 20 years, see that creeping in the other direction when we haven't even delivered on getting it lower than that very high amount at the referendum. I'd be very, very cautious about that.
There was also a couple of questions you might want to respond to, but you two. One, which you kind of already covered, but kind of are there murmuring to the PLP about this? What's your sense of the temperature there? And then the question from Tyron about everyone agrees on this, Prime Minister's making speeches about this, what are the practical obstacles that need to be removed?
So on the obstacles, I think it's generally agreed that when the changes that have been made already and the resettlement schemes that kind of added to the spike have settled down, that net migration is probably going to settle around the sort of 350,000 mark or thereabouts. So there are going to be big falls from that high of 900,000. I think the next debate we're going to have is about, okay, but we're still saying that for economic reasons, bearing in mind it's often about GDP, not GDP per capita, we could have that argument. But that's where the crunch is going to come. And that's where I go back to talking about the leadership from number 10 and the Home Office to say, well, if our economy is such and our jobs market is such that we feel like only people from abroad want to do these really important socially useful jobs, why is that? And we need to re-engineer our economy to ensure that they are fairly rewarded, is what I would say. So, so the direction of travel is right, but I don't know whether we have had that kind of reckoning to say, yeah, we're actually going to drive it even lower. But maybe it will settle at a lower amount than that. But I still think there's a debate to be had because I don't think it will fall as far as I think it personally should do. The other one.
There was something about murmurings in the PLP.
The welfare magnet conversation, was it? No, I haven't heard any. Can tell you that flatly.
Oh, I see.
No.
So was the question whether it was...
Whether you had kind of knowledge of it before going into government and I suppose the degree to which it still functions, and you see that as a correct thesis?
That Denmark is a welfare magnet? That's why people come?
Yeah.
I think that is, yes, shortly, yes, that matters. It's an attractive country to come to. Why do you travel all the way from Syria or Iraq all the way up through Europe and you come to Denmark? Of course, some people do it because they have family there already. But of course, it's also because it's a very comfortable, you can actually live a very comfortable life. Our benefits, you have pretty high benefits too in Denmark, in Britain, actually. Higher than in Sweden, which surprised me. But we have very high benefits, and of course that attracts, that's a part of it, it also attracts people. What we have in Denmark, which has really made a huge difference in this debate, is that we have a lot of data. We're a very digitalized society. We have a lot of knowledge and a lot of statistics on where people come from, what their crime rates are in Denmark, how much they are employed, like on how well they do in school, like on a country basis. And that has been a big part of the conversation in Denmark. And it's very hard to ignore, to be honest, when you have that sort of data. And I mean, we have some groups where like 40% are working, like from Somalia, for instance. It's very hard to integrate people from Somalia in the Danish economy. It's just a fact. We've had very effective labor unions in Denmark. They've done an amazing job. We don't have a minimum wage in Denmark. The minimum wage in Denmark is not official. It's set between the employers and the unions. And what would the minimum wage be? It would be like 16, 70 pounds, I guess, something like that. So you can't work in Denmark if your labor isn't worth 17 pounds per hour. Nobody's going to hire you. And if you come from Somalia, you're not worth 17 pounds per hour. That's just a fact. And so that's reality. They are not working. So it's not that's just very tough to integrate those people because they're not going to be working. And then there are other groups that are doing better, but we know how much it costs. Like we have these, the Minister of Finance every year publish a report. It's called like integration, and you can just see how much, like, and the number is like what the number shows is that people that come on work visas in Denmark are great. That's a great business case. We have a very high threshold to get into work, but they contribute more to the Danish economy than Danes do. They are more employed, and they pay more taxes, and they, of course, don't use our welfare system as much because when they come, they have an education already and they start working. So it's a great business case. But
we're running a bit short on time.
Okay, sorry.
Maybe we'll take kind of one final comment from the floor and then any absolute final comments here, and then we'll break things up. There's someone right at the back in the middle.
Hello, I'm Jack, and I work for Mel Stride, which probably goes to saying explaining what my question is. Do you think, Jonathan, given the almost lack of any sort of fiscal headroom and the current sort of orthodoxy of valuing low-wage migration or student visas to bogus courses, etc., do you think, given that orthodoxy and the lack of fiscal headroom, that Rachel Reeves would even be able to enact policies that would cut the number of migration from, like you said, the 350,000 that will probably land at, without making decisions that either departments or the Treasury say will reduce potential GDP, and therefore, given that the sort of Chancellor is kind of going almost quarter by quarter at the moment with your GDP figures, do you think that's even a realistic prospect that the party would be able to, and the government would be able to enact those sort of revolutionary sort of policies that are that we probably agree on the panel are needed to get to that lower figure?
Great, and that goes back to Tyron's question about the blockers as well. I will leave you both to have 30 seconds or something short to potentially reply and say anything else you want to say.
Yeah, so ultimately, I don't really accept the premise of the question. I think there's some good data actually finally being put together about the actual fiscal kind of benefits or not of immigration. So while it might cause kind of short-term panic, I don't actually think it's going to be as disastrous for GDP as the commentariat would have you believe, or certain parts of the commentariat at all. And of course, I would say, as a good socialist, that we can always raise more revenue if we feel like that is required to invest in the country which we can see crumbling around us.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay, then I'll just end on it's the same debate. We've had that debate in Denmark too, and you have the employers, what's representing all the employers. They want more labor to Denmark. And they use the same arguments. What the unions well, of course they say that. They get more people in, increase the supply of labor, and keep the wages down. And the unions in Denmark, they don't like that. They don't. So that's why we have a very high threshold for coming to work in Denmark.
Fantastic. All right, thank you. And thanks everyone for participating, being disagreeable, etc. Thank you.